Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Taste of Gen Z. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Ortega.
I'm the other co-host, Jake Davies, and certified music expert.
And today we're going to be talking about the topic that we brought up last week, which is classic rock. I think this is going to be an interesting episode because, something that you may not kind of directly associate with Gen Z, but really the history and the legacy that it left would influence the music we listen to triplefold. It's crazy to see where our music has come from that. And so today is going to be mostly dominated by our rock expert, Jake Davies. He knows a lot more about the subject than I do, but this is going to be a fun topic. So Jake, how do you feel about rock music?
I grew up on this stuff. A lot of people like to joke, because I like this type of music so much, that must mean I have a great relationship with my dad. That's true. We would always, listen to this stuff in the car. He would never let me put on like B96 or 103.5, 101.9. It was always on XRT. We were always listening to classic rock from anywhere from the 50s, 60s to, late 90s, early 80s, even though 80s music is a little questionable. We're not doing anything from that era today. I grew up on that music. I definitely agree with what you said. You can see a lot of the legacy it left in modern music, especially if you look at kind of like the emo rap specifically. A lot of specifically from Nirvana, like the grunge aspect, mixing heavy metal and punk rock. A lot of that influence can be seen in some of this modern rap music, especially some of the more emotional artists, like a few we mentioned last week, Juice WRLD and XXXTentacion. What are you doing over there, John?
Keep going. Keep talking.
All right. So today we're going to look at 3 songs. We have a Beatles song, a Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers song. Rest in peace, Tom Petty. And then we have a Nirvana song. And they're all very different. And that's one of our main talking points here, how we've seen a lot of stylistic changes over the years in the history of rock music. And we're also going to kind of branch off into the different genres of, soft rock, hard rock, grunge, which is what Nirvana is known for kind of pioneering.
Right.
We're going to try something new this week. I think we're going to try and actually play you guys some of the songs. The quality might not be the greatest, and we might get copyright stricken on YouTube. We're going to hope for the best here, and we're going to, do everything we can to make our podcast better for our viewers. So John, I think you're the DJ for us today, so why don't you give our viewers a little taste of our first song, The Long and Winding Road.
You bet. And I just wanted to clarify, I was shirtless for a second because I wanted to put on my Beatles shirt. I almost forgot, respect to the homies. Let me play our first song for us today, The Long and Winding Road.
The long and winding road to your door.
Feel free to jam along with us. These are some bangers we're going to be listening to.
I've seen that road before.
So we'll try and keep it quietly playing in the background. I'm not trying to have it copyright striked, but this is our first song, The Long and Winding Road, which, I wouldn't have chosen because I'm not I'm what you call a face value Beatles fan. So, I know all the popular songs, I know all those by heart, but, it takes someone like Jake, the music expert on this kind of music, to really get into the nitty-gritty songs and the ones that are truly meaningful to the Beatles other than their face value songs. So what do you have to say about this, Jake?
So before we get into the nitty-gritty of this song, I think we should just quickly go over kind of the progression of the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at, their early albums, Hard Day's Night, Help, most of the songs were they were all love songs about, there's a girl, she loves me, she might not love me, and we're singing about it. And they were kind of upbeat, happy songs that would kind of fall under the soft rock genre. And it wasn't until the later 60s, like the Rubber Soul, Revolver albums, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club, that they kind of started to branch out and more of like a psychedelic rock kind of band. And they would also, throw their love songs in there. And this song was actually released in 1970 on their last album, Let It Be. And, it's not really psychedelic rock. It's actually more of a love song, but it's one of the few like ballads that the Beatles do. And what I really like about this track is that it's just Paul and John. There's no Ringo's not on the drums. There's very little guitar. It's just it's focusing solely on the music and the lyrics, which is something that you didn't really see the Beatles do too often. They kind of stripped away a lot of the production here to just kind of give you a simple, focused song. And yeah, with that, if you have any comments, if not, we can just delve into the lyrics a little.
Oh, I know that, John and Paul happen, usually as a whole, the band performs to these songs, but when it just is John and when it's Paul, you kind of get the feeling that the song is going to be a more emotional one. I don't know. I feel like as though when it's just one of them singing, it really appeals to whatever the lyrics are, versus maybe the other songs where it's dominated by like a bunch of different aspects. And this one is clearly dominated by the voice. I know that Paul McCartney still does a little bit of music. He does his own thing. And I think even he did do a few songs with Kanye too. And he, for 4 or 5 seconds, which I think you remember with Rihanna and Paul McCartney, that one was where he was playing the instruments. But in Only One, he was also helping there as another Kanye song. But, I think the Beatles are, some fantastic lyricists as well as musicians. And so I guess that's what we're going to be doing here today, is diving into the lyrics a little bit more, kind of get a better understanding of what they're trying to convey with this song. So, Jake, if you want to go in with the nitty gritty.
Yeah, so there's not really, we like to think that a lot of songs kind of have a deeper meaning. But, sometimes it's just, Paul sitting down at the piano and it's just he's letting whatever comes to his mind kind of just take control. And this song, there's not really too much of a deeper meaning, but I think it kind of still has at least a metaphorical meaning. So he's talking about the long and winding road and how many times he's like been left standing there, crying for the day, left in a pool of tears in a wild and windy night. And I think it's kind of a metaphor for our life. I mean, no one really knows where, I guess you could kind of compare our life to a long and winding road. We don't really know what twists and turns it's going to take. And, there'll be disappointments too along the way. Not everything is explainable. I think that's another thing that the song is kind of is trying to address. Like sometimes bad things can happen to good people and there's really no explanation for that. That's just, that's just life. And I think, for our generation, the song can still, like this song can obviously, people can get a ton of value from songs like this in any generation. But, I think for our generation specifically, I think we touched on this in episode 1, but it feels like there's a lot of pressure to kind of have our life planned out ahead of us. And, there's a lot of pressure on, where we go to college, our test scores, what we want to do with our life, what career path we want to take. Like I'm sure anyone in our grade, anytime you go see distant family members or your relatives who you don't see too often, the first question they ask you is, oh, where are you going to college? What do you want to study? What are you going to do once you're out of college? Stuff like that.
Right.
But, I think this song just kind of emphasizes that, no one really knows what the heck could happen. Like one day things could be going fine and the next day things could be going awful, or awfully. And, it's just kind of a metaphor for the twists and turns that you can kind of experience in your life. And, yeah.
So I guess, a lot of people, you'll be remiss if someone doesn't know who the Beatles are, right? Like that's been one of the few bands throughout, they were in the 60s, 70s. That's one of the few bands that has stayed so prominent today. And it's been like, they go down in history as like some of the best musicians ever. So what do you think? Where do you think that comes from? Why do you think the Beatles, this band from the UK, has made such an impact on the United States, on everywhere else in the world, versus other bands? Why do you think they stand out the most?
Yeah, well, I think the Beatles, a lot of bands, they kind of like to keep themselves out of the spotlight, but the Beatles, they didn't really have that option. And with that popularity, you're kind of forced to, choose your own image and choose, how you want people to perceive you and how you want to use your influence. And I think the Beatles, they took that with a lot of responsibility, and they started to get political with their songs, especially John Lennon.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
in his solo career, if you look at a song like Imagine, that just has so much that's like it's just it's so countercultural, and the ideas are just so like countercultural, and it kind of inspired this, like if you look at the counterculture movement in the 70s with like all the hippies and stuff, it kind of inspired a lot of people to push beyond the normal and kind of just test the boundaries, I'd say. And with bands that have a lot of influence like that, the ones that really like leave a legacy like the Beatles, they obviously have to have great music, which I don't think anyone is doubting the Beatles have great music. Obviously, some of the best songs in history. But yeah, they leave a long lasting legacy on like, and they've definitely helped shift culture in the UK and in the US, I'd say.
Yeah, I'd say for sure too. I had just watched a video. I think it was with what's that guy's name? He goes in the car and he sings with people, and then they
Oh,
talk
James
about,
Corden.
yeah,
Carpool
James Corden
Karaoke.
was with one of the members, and I remember watching it and everyone like like just hearing word that he was around, everyone was following, everyone wanted to hear, and they performed a song at a bar at the end, and everyone loved it. The crowd was cheering, everyone knew the lyrics, every single word. It's one of those bands where they're so unoffensive, they're so likable. It's just hard not to like the music. I feel if there's anything that's contested, and that's a lot of music that's contested, the Beatles are one of the few that have earned that spot of there's no question, they're great.
Mhm.
um, so, I haven't listened extensively to the Beatles, but I know enough where, their music has been game changing. Their songs are so catchy. My personal favorite's Hey Jude. Yes, I know it's like one of the most popular ones, but it's just something about that. Nah, nah, nah. You know what I mean? Like you just can't not sing along to it. What do
Mhm.
you think your favorite songs are from the Beatles?
I would say I like the acoustic version on the anthology album of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I'd say that's probably my favorite Beatles song. But
Very
it fluctuates. Sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. I also really like In My Life. It's a good one.
Mhm.
But yeah, the most controversial thing the Beatles ever did was when John Lennon said that the Beatles were
Oh, God.
bigger than Jesus, and and that wasn't really offensive in the UK, but a lot of people, especially in the southern United States, took great offense to that and actually started burning Beatles records. Um, but other than that, the Beatles kind of used their influence very responsibly and kind of maintained a positive image in the public light, um, which is very important for people with that amount of influence. Um, and we kind of contrasted this with last week's episode. We talked about how a lot of modern musicians aren't really setting the best example
No, they don't
for our
care.
youth.
Uh,
Um, but
I
yeah,
think
so obviously the Beatles were a very influential band, and they left a great legacy, and they went on to inspire a lot of other bands and musicians to kind of do their own thing and kind of push beyond the boundaries of normal music. Because like at the time, the stuff the Beatles were doing in the late '60s, psychedelic rock, no one was really kind of expecting that from the Beatles.
right.
And that just wasn't really considered normal music at the time. That was kind of like we talked about this with Kanye too, pushing the boundaries with auto tune and kind of pushing the boundaries of their genre and kind of expanding it. And with that, it allows other artists to kind of squeeze their way in and put their own twist on the rock genre.
Yeah, and it's crazy to see, when we were researching for this episode, how when we're trying to define rock, and we're trying to listen to different songs of rock, like how much that entails, like the three songs that we picked were just probably some of the most prominent examples of how different rock can be, because the Beatles had pushed for artists to break the boundaries and kind of make their own music, because rock isn't just this one specific idea, right? It's whatever you want it to be with specific characteristics. That doesn't mean that it has to be some homogeneous type of music. So that's why we have songs like Lithium, we have songs like Running Down a Dream. It's crazy to see how much it has changed since the 60s, but how it still is the same. It's still rock. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. All right, so should we give our viewers a taste of our second song, Running Down a Dream?
Yes, I think they'll like this one. This is a very catchy one for sure. What the? It's not coming down right. Oh, here it is. Okay. And immediately you could tell it's a completely different start to the song than the Beatles before.
Rub my eyes.
I mean, this is a very catchy song. I remember you played this song for me because I like to think that we are a little more experimental with our music, right? So we're always bouncing off different songs in the car whenever we're together. And I remember you played this song, and it's not something I had heard before, but it was just like, it's something that makes you move right away. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's very catchy.
I'd say certain songs kind of have an energy,
Mm-hmm.
And this song, it's interesting. We looked at the long and winding road, and we kind of talked about how that was a metaphor for life. And the same can be said about this song. I feel like it's talking about chasing a dream, working on a mystery, not knowing where that leads. And yeah, that's, as we were saying with the long and winding road, that's kind of a metaphor for our life now. It's we're not really knowing where we're going from here, and we're just kind of taking one day at a time.
And I think this is kind of a microcosm of what rock really is, right? The whole genre is about individuality, right? And, it's clear from just both these songs that you can't just expect society to shape what you want to be, It's a very common theme within rock that you're your own person. That's why this whole genre came out in the first place. It was a contrast to all like the lighter kind of how do you say, not as like you said, there's an energy to these songs that is way different than what used to be before this genre. And I think that just the idea that you can be your own person is so common within rock and with Tom Petty that it really just made the genre a lot more fun to listen to, made people want to listen to it, right? Because if they're constantly being told that, don't limit yourself, then, people are going to keep coming back to that source of inspiration, that source of a different perspective that'll keep them going. So yeah, it's just crazy to see that these two songs have completely different lyrics, completely different styles of music, or style of rock, but they talk about the same thing in an essence.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that they're two completely different styles of rock, and what the Beatles were kind of known for, their kind of soft rock songs. Granted, some of their songs were hard rock, like "I Saw Her Standing There." That's a good one. "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" is also a good example. But for the most part, a lot of their songs were slower. They were still rock songs, but were slower and were more melodic than some of the more harder rock songs. Um, this song specifically is a great example of what I would consider hard rock. You know, another good example would be a lot of Rolling Stones songs, Led Zeppelin. Those are all good examples of hard rock. Um, and it's kind of interesting how different these songs can sound, even though they're within the same genre. Just kind of changing the tempo and kind of giving it a little bit more of an upbeat attitude just completely changes the tone of the song. But despite that, they can still express, you know, similar messages. You brought up a great point about how a lot of rock music is about kind of expressing your individuality. Um, and yeah, we were saying earlier that the Beatles kind of when they started to push the boundaries of this genre, they kind of forced people to express their own individuality in their in you know their respective rock songs, and that kind of helped to move the genre forward. And that's where we start to see all this like branching off into different types of rock music, whether it be punk, metal, or you know, in our next example that we're going to look at, grunge rock. It's yeah, it's just very interesting to see how much the genre has evolved since the Beatles and more traditional rock bands.
And I think it, you know, what we were talking about is so evident in the fact that people still argue Beatles, Rolling Stones, right? Because they're both rock bands, right? But they each have their own different style that, in a way, kind of the question itself limits, you know, the two different styles of rock. You know, it's something that, or at least that seems to me, is almost uncomparable. But it just shows that because people are always trying to combat one or the other, that you know, there's all these different individual thought processes on what rock is and what constitutes good rock. And so, you know, you're talking last week about how you and your dad have different opinions on which one is better, but it's, in the long run, they're both two different takes on the same genre, and they both still helped inspire all these different types of all this different type of music, all this different type of individuality. So unless you have anything else to say, we can dive into the last part of what rock evolved to in this last century.
All right, sounds good.
So let me play a clip of the last song that we are going to be talking about. This is one of my personal favorites. Just it's just hard to not like, at least in my opinion. Oh, hold on, I got it.
I'm so happy, 'cause today from my friends in my bed, I'm so worried. That's okay, 'cause so are you. Someday morning, every day for all I care. My mind's clear.
And here's the best part.
In all days, 'cause I found God.
See, and I think that is where you start to considerably see the difference in the type of music that rock was created. So this is taking place in like the late 80s, early 90s. And I think it's such a good capture of what those decades represented in culture. So Lithium itself and Nirvana evolved and are qualified as grunge rock, which was this new genre that came out during the time, where there's a lot more edgy, a lot more punk, a lot more counterculture, right? Which evolved from the 70s and 80s about, you know, feelings against war, against, you know, capitalist greed and stuff like that, where it started creating this set of people who wanted to speak against that in their own more aggressive way. And so what this band did was, you know, they had this song, which is one of their top ones, which is the one that most people know, along with Smells Like Teen Spirit. But this song talks about how you know, a lot of people grew up Christian, and a lot of people had faith in their life, but around that time it was starting to be challenged. You know, a lot more people are starting to go against that. once the church came out against contraceptives and stuff like that. But he takes this opportunity to talk about the role of religion in his life and how um, it can fill the void of emptiness that a lot of people felt at the time. But instead, other people would turn to drugs. So he turned to God, which in the end didn't end up being the case because he did a lot of recreational drugs, and it could have caused
Recreational. What? Overdose of heroin, dude. That's not a recreational drug.
recreational and
You literally just read an entire book about heroin and you're calling it a recreational drug? Come on. You gotta know your social justice
and
issues.
other substances. I didn't want to go into it, but sure, yeah, he did that too. And it's sad to see a lead singer like that go. That was so defining. And then when he did commit suicide, Kurt Cobain, a lot of people were shook by that because he had helped define this whole idea that and made more apparent the culture of rock, which is individuality. He wasn't scared to say what was on his mind. He was always against the grain. He was always pushing what society deemed as was the norm. Even so, in an MTV performance, he was supposed to do a live performance of Smells Like Teen Spirit, but they told him that he had to lip sync it. He couldn't do it live. So since he was told that, he didn't like that, and he ended up making it so clear that it was supposed to be lip synced. He was just messing with the crowd. And it's just such a clear example of how he wasn't just going to take what was thrown at him and accept that as what needs to be, And that was what rock had evolved into. What was once individuality in music genre and music type became individuality in expression and going against the culture that was so dominant for so long. So that's why Nirvana is one of my personal favorites. This song is one of my personal favorites. And it does have a negative impact on some people. I know one of our friends, we'll call him William, always attributes, this kind of music to depression and angst and, negative connotations like that. But really, it's more than what some of the lyrics might lead you to believe. It just helps people understand that they're not alone, that when they feel that something they're being told isn't right, that they have other people behind them challenging that, and that they aren't just going to accept that as fact. So what do you think about the band Nirvana?
I think I agree with a lot of what you said about, the genre as a whole, the grunge genre. So just to give a quick background, we mentioned like all the different types of rock music, but grunge specifically is kind of a mix between punk rock and heavy metal. And just a quick fun fact, my mom is a huge punk rock fan. Her favorite punk rock band is The Cure. She had a mohawk back in the day, just for a little bit. And she won two punk rock dance competitions back in the day. Yeah. So it's a mix of punk rock and heavy metal, which are kind of two of the grittier. They're on the grittier spectrum of rock and roll. But I think with the band Nirvana specifically, like, if you look at a song like "Smells Like Teen Spirit," when you listen to the song, you might not really even understand what he's saying. But for some reason, it's catchy. And if you really go in depth and look at the lyrics, you can find a lot of metaphorical value and more of a deeper meaning in the songs, which I think is great about rock and roll is you can listen to a song just to listen to it, just to enjoy the music, but you can also listen to a song and get something from it, and learn a lesson from it, which I think is something that's so great about bands like Nirvana, bands like the Beatles, bands like the Rolling Stones.
You brought up something that I forgot to mention. So with their song "Smells Like Teen Spirit," that's clearly their most popular one, right? Like, most people know it, most people jam along to it, whatever. But it became so popular that Nirvana ended up hating it, right? They didn't want to perform it. they were always grudged against the idea that people like them for that one song. A lot of people would always misinterpret it or, kind of undermine it and just label it as, just a nice headbanging song, right? But it's more than that. He's always Kurt and the band has always been so adamant about making sure people understand what they're trying to say and that there's more to rock than just the music. He, if you just look at his later albums, it's clear that he doesn't care what people think about what he's putting out. He has a song called "Rape Me," and it's something that's so it's just so explicit. You don't expect a song title to be named that, and for the lyrics to go into how he like what seems to be about how he wants to be raped and something like that. It's just so against what music has been put out in the past few decades. So I think they really set the trend, putting out whatever music you want, despite whether people agree with it or not. You need to have your sense of individualism. You need to, would be willing to stick it to the man. That's what the common phrase was at the time. That's what other bands like Rage Against the Machine and others, kind of put their music around. But really, it's just, I'm not going to conform. I'm going to be my own person, and that's what my music's going to reflect. And we've been going around this recurring theme about how this is all rock, right? This is all under the broad umbrella of rock, and you can clearly see the difference. Again, this is more of a headbang songs. This isn't your Beatles song. You're not usually headbanging to the Beatles, but because of this, they ended up causing rap and hip hop to be a lot more open, expressional. They cause a lot more bands willing to experiment with different types of instruments, different types of beats, and really, I think their overarching influence since Kurt's death has been something that we cannot ignore. So with that being said, I think that's all I could say about Nirvana right now. But is there any last words you wanted to say?
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, Nirvana kind of pioneered this genre of grunge rock and roll. And I think one of the more defining characteristics is when you look at Nirvana, play live, it's almost like it looks as though they're putting almost no effort into their performance, but they're still having a good time on stage and they're still performing their songs. But it's kind of like, I don't know, it's almost like they're putting less importance on the performance aspect, and they're putting more of a focus on the lyrics behind the song, even though you might not always be able to understand what they're saying, which I think is actually really fascinating. And just to kind of quickly glance over Lithium again. So as John mentioned, it's kind of a song about how Kurt Cobain finds God. But if you look closely at some of the other lyrics, he says, "I'm so lonely, but that's okay. I'm so ugly, but that's okay." It's really a song about acceptance, and whether that acceptance be, in Kurt Cobain's case, from God or, from your peers. It's really a song about kind of accepting your own individuality. And that's kind of a theme we've touched on in all three songs and the rock and roll genre as a whole. It's a lot about individuality and how you can express that individuality through, your defined sound and your lyrics. But yeah, other than that, I don't really have too much else to say. And should we go into detail a little bit about what we're planning on doing for episode 4?
I know some of you guys were really excited to see Ronald Davies, Jake's dad, here today, but unfortunately the man is on other podcasts. He's very famous. He's very renowned music expert, so we need to book him for next time. But be sure that you will be hearing from his takes. We're going to be leaving the next episode up to you guys. Want to hear kind of suggestions, what you guys want to hear. We were thinking about a few different ideas. We could
R&B, country if enough people request it, but Please
I mean,
don't.
we could also do, if you guys want to get a little more on the fun side, the Guardians of the Galaxy movies have been worshipped as having the best soundtrack in the past 20 years, and how they kind of combine all these different music at the time to make one great playlist, awesome mixtape. So we could also go into that, but you guys are reviewers, we want to hear what you guys think. Other than that, do you have any last words?
I'd just like to apologize. I didn't really give my dad enough of a heads up to come record the podcast. He actually had a business call because he's a businessman. He does business stuff, so he's on a business call right now, doing business things. So he couldn't be here today, but next week he'll be on. We'll interview him first because we were going to interview him about classic rock, but we're going to interview him first things first next episode, and we're going to kind of see how he was influenced by music growing up, and how kind of the medium of how you listen to music has changed over the years, and his thoughts on how that's impacting music culture. So be sure to report back next week. Our episode will be up, I believe, next Friday. And we'll see you guys then. So this has been Taste of Gen Z. I'm your co-host, Jake Davies.
And I'm your other co-host, Jonathan Ortega. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys next week. Peace.